There have been many innovations in the area of computer use for entertainment, especially in bars and arcades over the years. We've seen video games, we've seen pinball machines, we've seen jukeboxes, we've seen your strength testers and all that good stuff. But our guest today, well, he was part of a project that was trying to do something truly innovative, something that only digital technology could have done. And, well, as we will see, a couple years later, the internet was going to take off with his concept. And that is dating. Dating as not coin-operated directly, but let's call it coin-operated machine. Welcome to the show, Ray Thackery.
Oh, you were just saying coin-operated, amusement, arcade, and machines. And yeah. I was just, well, actually, we didn't mess with coins. We went for dollars.
Like I said, calling it coin-op is wrong, but that's the technical term, I guess. But yeah, you were going for a slightly bigger amount. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back. And as we always like to do here on the show, let's start with your educational background. So we have an idea where you're starting before you start to implement anything. So give us a little bit of background on you.
Most of my early life as a young boy, I was into amateur radio. And so I learned how to build my own receivers and transmitters. Because in those days, in the 1960s, you couldn't afford to buy that kind of equipment as a child. So by the time I was 16, I passed the amateur radio exam in England, and I got my first TAM license, as they call it in America. And with that electronics background, I went into Bangor University in North Wales to get a degree in electronics. And the electronics degree had a computing kind of emphasis back in those days.
So, and just for my own education here, if you're building a ham radio back in the 60s, are you actually just sitting there soldering the pieces together, or is it a ready-made kit? Are you finding the transistors yourself and trying to figure out, what are you going to need to build this? How does that work?
Well, goodness, no, is right from the design process. I designed my own transmitters and receivers.
Holy crap.
And soldered all of the individual components together and purchased them from, mainly in England, we got them from old Army and Navy stores where the Army and Navy sold old equipment, tank radios and battleship radios and, surplus equipment. And my friends and I, we would rip it apart and we would take the vacuum tubes for the PAs and get a 100-watt PA, linear amplifier, that kind of thing. And we just designed and built our own stuff.
Wow. Okay. As a person who grew up in a much later period when, vacuum tubes weren't a thing anymore and stuff, there's a certain
transistors did become very useful when they came out and when they could handle more than 5 watts at 144 megahertz.
But there's just a romantic notion about that era that is just so you're off to university, you're going to get a degree applying basically your passion, your hobby. How does that work out? What do you end up with as a piece of paper in your hand at the end?
I ended up with a degree in electronics from Bangor University, which is in North Wales, and it was a focus on computer science. So we had a couple of one analog and 2 digital computers that we had in those days. A kind of machine that people would never recognize today. I mean, for example, a discrete transistor Elliott 803, which is a British-made computer.
Okay.
And, somehow with 64 megabytes of memory, we made it do things. And, to actually compile a program, to the operating system into the program and then compile the programs using paper tape, punched paper. So, back in those days in the early 70s, that's all we had, man. And so, you're on paper tape or paper cards into the machine. And when you got results, it punched it out onto a teletype machine or onto punch cards. And you turn the punch cards into text, or the result of the program.
It just sounds like such an effective and efficient way of doing things.
Really? Well, let me put it this way. When I saw my first graphical user interface on a PDP-8 from digital in about 1975, that was a revelation to me.
Oh, I can imagine. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, that would be a completely different world. I mean, So when do you graduate? Which year?
1975.
75. Okay. And now, what is your first move? Where do you go to work with a degree in computers in 75?
Yeah. Back in the UK, I worked for a Solartron company called a Schlumberger company called Solartron. And Solartron built military exercise equipment, for example, laser-guided targeting for military training, soldiers shooting at tanks and tanks shooting at soldiers. We also built mass flow transducers for the oil fields so that they could, monitor the amount of oil and slurry that was going through pipelines. So it was basically industrial or military electronics. And
okay.
I basically started in that area.
I have to ask, because this is a question that's come up in articles I've read over the years. So if you're using a laser-guided system for military exercises, especially, let's say, tanks. Now, tanks, if they're actually shooting shells, you don't have a straight line like, let's say, a bullet would relatively have. You'd have to do an arc. How do you do that with a laser? I mean, what was the calculation or what was the system there to figure out where a shell was going to land?
Right. So the laser could determine the distance, through a sighting system, and it could determine the direction, compass direction. And once you had that, then we had to write in the software for the trajectory of the projectile. And then, basically at that point, then the elevation of the gun and that kind of thing was just basically simple, trajectory calculations from the basic data.
And were you actually building machines that would fit onto the equipment, or would they just be sending radio signals back and being calculated by a central machine?
No, well, the laser sensors were built onto the tank. And obviously not on the actual gun barrel itself, but on the body of the tank.
Yeah.
And then that fed into a small computer, and there was a battlefield computer that was operating by radio, so that the people with the sensors, for example, the soldiers, would have a vest, and the vest had a sensor. So if they were hit by the laser, then it would knock them out. They had to lie down on the battlefield and pretend to be dead.
And then hope the tank didn't run over them.
In my knowledge, it never happened, but I was never on the battlefield, right?
Yeah. No, sorry. I just recently ran across an article from 63 or 73, sorry, where they were talking about that kind of system. So when you mentioned it, and they didn't give a good description of how it worked. They were just like laser guided sights on tanks. And I was like, how is that going to work? So thank you. You've just filled in one of my gaps. So, okay. So you're working on this kind of equipment. And is it fulfilling? Is it really cutting edge? What does it feel like at that point?
Oh, I hated it. No, I really wanted, frankly, at that time in my life, I really wanted to get to the heart of the industry, which at the time was on Route 128, in Boston, Massachusetts. All of the big computer companies, IBM's headquarters was Albany, New York, which was literally, an hour and a half drive from Boston, Route 128. Digital Equipment Corporation was the kind of, by far the top mini computer manufacturer. Everybody had a PDP-11, right, back in those days. And Prime Computer and Data General and Computer Vision, they were all on Route 28, Massachusetts. So, at that time, I wanted to get the heck out of England and into the United States. So then I joined an American company called Tektronix, which built two different things. It built computer graphics systems back in the late 1970s and the early 80s. And of course, the biggest claim to fame is test and measurement equipment, oscilloscopes. So, there are two major oscilloscope pioneers in the world. There's Hewlett-Packard and there's Tektronix. So I joined Tektronix, and they're in Beaverton, Oregon. And so, when I was with Tektronix, I had an opportunity to move to the USA. And that's what I eventually ended up doing.
I mean, being in Oregon, you were actually closer to Boston in England than you would be in Oregon, practically.
Well, I found it amazing because the very first time I ever flew to the States was by Laker Airlines, which are now defunct. But Laker had an airline, and he flew to Bangor, Maine, and then from Bangor, Maine to Los Angeles. And what blew me away for the first time, and this is back in the late 70s, was that it took longer to cross the United States than it did from Britain to the United States over the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, it's a big landmass, a very big one. So you get to Oregon. What does the tech scene look like in Oregon in the late 70s?
Well, it was pretty limited, although in those days, Tektronix had about 90% of the worldwide computer graphics market in terms of hardware and software. So if anybody knows about, the direct view by stable storage screen, the DVST screen, we had 4,096 resolution X and Y axis, screens back in those days in the late 70s.
Wow.
And they were used for computer circuit design, mechanical design, aircraft, you name it. So it was very leading edge stuff. But, the whole world shifted very rapidly when, color, graphic screens became available as a common thing. So I got out of that and I joined Digital Equipment in Massachusetts. And, that's where the real, the heart of the computing industry was in those days. Definitely.
Now, your late 70s, we're talking slowly the beginning of what will become the microcomputer revolution. What was your perception of that as somebody who was working outside of that area in the bigger machines, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, Digital Equipment, I was into mini computers. I mean, the older people will recognize the name PDP-11, VAX computers. And, we were enormous. I mean, we were chasing IBM. We were going from $7 billion a year, growing 30% year on year with a 90% gross profit,
Wow.
Those days, it was astonishing. That was the mini computer business was huge, but then PC came along, and let's face it, the PC killed companies like Digital, they were just not able to respond fast enough. And on the tail of the PC, of course, was the workstation, such as the Apollo. You may have heard of the Apollo workstation, of course, on Microsystems. Both of those two companies basically took over the market. And when they started to develop servers, so you had a Sun server, you had a Unix servers in an engineering shop, then Digital Equipment became, basically an also ran. And the company ended up acquired by Compaq, right? A PC company, and I got out.
Okay, so you're with them until the end, basically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I do have to ask here. Obviously, your background was in hardware. What was your work relationship with software through this period?
Yeah. My later years at Digital, I became a consultant internally and externally, to our customers in a methodology called quality function deployment, or QFD. And it was a way of doing software development. There was a concurrent engineering methodology. So most people back in those days, in the early 80s, they were still operating a sequential engineering paradigm. And when I talk about sequential engineering, I mean a software developer writes software. The hardware developer then takes, the software and matches it with a computer system, puts the two together and see if they work. And then they didn't work. So the software developer started again from square one, and they went around in a big circle until they got a system that worked. And, it was a very long-term cyclic development system. So concurrent engineering meant that you develop your software and your hardware and your interfaces and the services and everything that goes with delivering a system, and you develop simultaneously like this. So basically everybody starts at the same time and works together. And that's when I started getting into developing systems using a concurrent engineering methodology.
Okay.
So I became used as a consultant in the organization, and I ended up getting more involved in actual in the software development side.
Okay. So by the time you leave Digital, and I don't have the year in front of me, what year do they get purchased by Compaq?
I didn't make it all the way through to the eventual Compaq deal. I've got to dig down in the memory bank. I think I actually left about 1993.
Okay.
Maybe 1994.
Gotcha. And at that point, you're a consultant. So are you still a full-time employee doing consulting work for different departments, or are you already independent at that point?
No, I was still with Digital until I left.
Okay.
And we were working on, amazing projects. Like there's a very famous computer project that Digital worked on we called it internally the Aquarius. It was known externally to the world as the VAX 9000. And it was the crossover between a mini computer and a mainframe computer, where Digital was trying to catch up with IBM and trying to compete directly with IBM as the mainframe, leader in the world at the time. Unfortunately, that the company spent about $900 million to $1 billion on developing the system, and it was absolutely huge, for that time of the millennium. And unfortunately, we only ended up building a few of them. And so I was called in as a consultant to analyze, our development process and how it all worked together. And so we got the hardware engineers, the software engineers in a room. We built a methodology called quality function deployment. We looked at the quality, the house of quality is called, where we mapped, the features of the system against the design elements of the system, and how did the two interlink. So you have design elements, and then you convert them into a feature that meets the end user requirement. We found that the two kind of were discontinuous. In a few days session, we ended up with programmers and hardware developers virtually sitting at their desks crying because none of it was coming together.
Oh man!
And within weeks, $1 billion project was cancelled. So so I was instrumental in taking $1 billion project and scrapping it. But I'm glad we scrapped it before it became a $2 billion failure.
Exactly. I mean, okay, so it's the early 90s. Obviously, the PC and servers are taking the world by storm. You have developed these new methods for developing software and hardware concurrently. Where do you go from here?
Well, that's the critical question when it comes to this product that you discovered we call Daterbase. And when I say database, I mean DATER, as in, just people trying to connect with each other. A fellow by the name of George Van Treek, also at Digital Equipment, somebody who I would personally call a bona fide genius. One of those kind of people who could literally do anything, and memorizes absolutely everything and can access the data instantly in his own head. I recognize this guy worked for me at the time, so I thought I'm going to have him do a project with me in our spare time. So outside of digital, we created an application that was originally intended to be kind of an example of how to do software and hardware development together to come up with a very cheap, very fast, very functional system, with the lowest possible cost. And of course, it's always very hard to come up with the cheapest, fastest, most functional, most effective system there is, right? You can get maybe 2 out of 3 or 2 out of 4 if you're lucky. And we were going for it and to come up with an actual working example. And so we thought, okay, what should we do? Well, people like to get together. Let's try that. And so we developed a system called Database. And this is before the internet was available. And so, of course, how do people connect when the internet doesn't exist? Well, we built a machine that could go into a bar or, into a public place, where people could actually walk up to the machine, type in their personal profile. It took a photograph of them. It had a touch screen, and it would take money or a credit card. We had a cash reader and a credit card reader built into the same machine. And this was back about 1990, I think 1992. I'm losing track of the exact year.
And 92 is when the first articles about the device start showing up in the trade magazines.
Oh, really? Okay. I've lost track of those. I've got to go back and read them. So about that time, we actually built the machine, and we put it into various bars. And because the internet didn't exist, we actually had them connected to a telephone line in the bar, and they could dial our server, which we hosted at home, in a basement, as most internet pioneers did in those days. And then we had our own server, which was basically our own internet server. The machines dialed up, they mixed up the profiles of the people. It matched the people up, and it sent the profiles back to all the machines in all the bars. So we were effectively, creating our own private internet for that one application. And that's the system that you read about, the database.
Yeah. So. Okay, now you start this project out to show, how to develop efficiently, effectively, but obviously there's a billion different applications you could have used to test this.
Right.
And instead, you're going now with, number one, it's a commercial product. It's a not consumer level product, but it's still a product that's going to be used by everyday consumers, which obviously requires a very different type of standard for how much harm it can suffer. It's going to be requiring something that in the early 90s was still a little bit off. You're going to have to take photos of people. You're doing this, the storage of data. It's going to require a back-end infrastructure. So my question is, who was the test for originally? Who was the target market for the test? Were you just saying we're going to create something so we can show it off as a calling card to future employers, or was the idea always that this test needed to produce a commercially viable product at the end?
All very good questions, and a mix of everything, really. At first, we wanted to prove that we could do it. that we could come up with a very complicated system. In those days, a device that would freestand in a bar, like a video game machine that had a touch screen, that could accept cash, that could connect to a server elsewhere. That was completely unheard of. Nobody's done anything like it. Not even Las Vegas with the gambling machines in those days. They were all standalone machines. So there was just nothing like it, and we made it all work, and it actually did work. And at first we thought that's a great calling card, but of course it's got to become popular. So we worked hard on making it popular, and we got kind of caught up in it. As things happen. We even tried to get venture capital funding to allow us to build it into, a more nationwide system. But because the internet hadn't really taken off, venture capital companies were not really interested in a flyer like that. And even once the internet got going, about 1997, 1998, we were still actually, George Van Treek and I, we were still connected and trying to make it happen. Although we both had different other jobs to make a living. Me still in the software industry, and frankly, so was George. But the bottom line was, in the background, we were still trying to get this product up and running. Having improved our methodology, we weren't able to show something that had grown into a real viable nationwide profit-making product. So we still kept trying, and to the point where once the internet got started, in the late 90s, and the venture capital companies were looking for that kind of product in Silicon Valley. By then, both George and I were actually now living in San Francisco Bay Area. And we tried to find venture money, but we just found it very difficult, almost impossible. And it was kind of, it was a very sad thing that, what we developed was the fundamental beginning of Match.com, which is now a multi-billion-dollar public corporation. Yeah. We had everything in our system that Match.com has now.
And so
back in the early 90s.
For our listeners, I think we need to take another step back and actually talk about the product and the experience of using the product. So let's talk about what Daterbase was. If we're looking at it from a consumer standpoint, we're going to get back into the software side of it a little bit. But from a consumer standpoint, what are we looking at? What does the physical machine look like?
Well, what we did was something that is probably very common to everybody, or most unmarried people, or maybe some married people now, online dating. But we had to create it from scratch because the internet didn't exist at the time. So we designed and built the very first global online dating terminal. And it was a terminal in a bar that collected money, for signing in. And we had a touch screen, and people answered questions that we would ask about their personal profile. It had a camera built in. It took a shot. It took a couple of shots of the person and put the picture in the database. And the touch screen allowed people to, type in answers to multi-choice personality questions, their age, their location, all of the typical questions that you have to do in a dating online software program that you do today. We didn't have geolocation in those days, so you had to put your zip code in, right? But basically, what we designed was everything that you see today in Match.com. And when we released it, it was far and away a decade ahead of anything else in the world in its time, with the same kind of feature. And that was matching, boyfriends, girlfriends. I mean, we were even far enough to recognize that it wasn't just boyfriends and girlfriends. So, we'd even gone that far, which some of them haven't even gone to yet, but there we are. So, we were seriously, well and truly, a decade ahead of the online dating that, people have today on their telephone.
Oh, definitely. So now the terminal obviously has to have a keyboard.
No, we did not put a keyboard on. We put a touch screen in. And so a keyboard was actually the touch screen. People would type out their name, their birth date on the screen itself.
Oh, excellent. That probably also saved a lot of problems with mechanical repair issues.
Yeah, you don't want people pouring beer into a keyboard in a bar.
That's true. That's true. Now, from a financial standpoint, what was the cost of using it? We already hinted it wasn't coins. So,
Yeah, we
what was
started
the
out.
business model there?
We started out. We actually figured out how to accept dollar bills back in those days. So we took $1, for somebody to create a profile, and $1 if they wanted to actually communicate with somebody that they liked on the screen.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
took a note and accepted a note.
Cool. And so each message cost $1, or each was there a login fee just to check and see if you had any messages or?
Yeah, we played with it. We tried online sign-ups for free, then charge them $1 if they saw somebody they liked and they wanted to get an introduction. So a whole range of those kind of things. So we ended up charging $1 for a transaction, for an introduction, that kind of thing. And we didn't only have a cash reader, but we also had a credit card reader on the machine. So people could, if they were well and truly drunk and they wanted to get introduced to 20 people, they would put their credit card in and away they went.
Very
in other
cool.
words, the drunker people got, the more money we got, right?
So in this initial phase of the machine, how many units did you actually have deployed?
In the early days, we only made, I think it was 7 units. And we got together with actually a video game manufacturer who wanted to branch out into new areas. So they actually built it into a very professional video game box and acted as a partner with us. So, we just provided the software and they built up the rest, and we were able to sit back and watch it being, sent out. But unfortunately, it never went past 7 units.
Too bad. So now you've got these 7 units deployed, I'm guessing all around San Francisco.
Yeah.
You're maintaining the system back. Was it? Now you obviously also need that phone line. So how did that conversation go, let's say with a bar owner, that there's going to have to be a phone line for this?
It was way too complicated, man. We literally had to go in. We had to say to the bar manager, look, we need a phone line. It's got to be able to make a phone call 10 times a day. We need to connect it to your bar phone. Don't worry, it won't mess up your phone when you're trying to talk to your customers or whatever. But it was a complicated installation. It's not like connecting a device to the Wi-Fi, and off you go. So it just wasn't practical back in those days before the internet really got started.
Gotcha. And I mean, obviously you're approaching these people. Did you have any, from a business standpoint, I guess, did you have any criteria for what kind of bars you wanted to place it in? How does that work? Because obviously that's outside of your normal area of expertise.
Yeah, we don't know. We did have market research. We were looking for, bars, very popular bars, with mixed, thousands of people every day. We were looking for the kind of place where, people would consider them to be meat markets. A typical dating bar, where, and also in San Francisco, Bay Area, it is a place where people were interested in something new and were willing to try something out. So a lot of things came together, but the fact that the internet really hadn't taken off was a big negative. And, to be able to have to host our own server and our own communications using dial-up, those kind of things all became either too complicated or too costly to be sustainable as a business. So we never really made it. We never took off with the product.
Gotcha. Now, I got to ask, towards the end, how big was the database that you ended up amassing? How many people created profiles on this thing?
Well into the 10,000s. It's pretty
Impressive.
exciting. It was pretty exciting. I wanted to date a few of those girls myself back in those days. Let's put it this way: it was tempting to look into the database for free. But we had our own rules and we tried to live by them. But seriously though, we actually did go to the venture capital firms, and we got to the point where we thought we were, literally able to get the $2 or $3 million we thought we needed to build it out as an internet product. The way that Match.com did in the very beginning, some years later. Unfortunately, we just simply weren't able to crack the venture capital funding, and we were not able to get our money to get started. And so, the project kind of languished at that point. And all I can say is I'm kind of satisfied to see it's grown into a global phenomenon, with multiple multi-billion-dollar corporations now doing what we created back in those days, but we didn't actually make it ourselves.
Too bad. Now, what were the conversations with the venture capitalists like? I mean, it's obviously before the internet, but venture capital was still already big. Everybody knew tech was going someplace. So what was their reaction to this device, or what were their objections to this device?
Well, we started early on, of course, before the internet really, cranked up to where it was ubiquitous. And generally, it was very difficult to get an appointment with a venture capital company in Palo Alto, right? On University Avenue or on the street where all the VC firms seem to be these days. It was quite difficult to get engaged. But when the internet started to become far more of a global phenomenon towards the late 90s, we kept trying. And we actually did get some traction with venture capital firms. Now, I won't mention any particular names, but we met with one of the great ones, one of the one of the most well-known ones that funded companies like Facebook, eventually, companies like Google, and so on. And we got to the point where at one stage in one of those VC companies, we thought we were going to be getting funded to the tune of $2 or $3 million. But they had a board meeting, and we had a meeting after the board meeting with the project, controller, with the partner who was talking to us. And I remember his words distinctly. It was, well, Ray, we think it's a fantastic project. We think it will make real money. We think it'll grow, and we think it has a future. But, right now, we think the whole thing sounds a little bit sleazy.
That doesn't
so
surprise
therefore they
me.
decided not to get involved. Now, I hope they regret missing out on Match.com, right?
Well, and that's one of the things that I was thinking about was, there is a certain stigma attached to dating websites and so forth. So yeah, I can imagine the VCs talking about it this way. Now, going back,
we were the first ones.
Exactly.
So we got the sleazy kind of label. And then by the time Match.com had got a bit of traction, they were able to do it fairly cheaply from a garage. They got some initial seed funding to help them. They beat us. We didn't get the seed funding. And, frankly, George and I missed out on about 8 years of time because we had to earn a living.
Yeah.
And so we were earning a living while not actually, pushing Database. And so we missed out on the whole thing in the end, and Match.com took over, and they won it. As you know, Match.com, ended up being the premium or the basically the prime dating agency online, and then it became part of normal life for all single people. Yeah, so it was not easy anymore.
Yeah, even in the early 2000s, there was a lot of stigma surrounding it. But it picked up. It almost felt like by 2003, that had shifted to where, everybody was familiar enough with everyday internet use that it didn't seem awkward anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
So
now
we had that stigma, we had that label, and we were unfortunately not able to break through it. And timing and having to earn a living kind of got in the way too.
Yeah. So let's go back to the internals of the machine. So you're obviously coming from a hardware design standpoint, but it's my understanding everything inside the box is pretty much off-the-shelf components, right? So what did you choose to use, and why did you go that route?
Okay, so in the early 80s, sorry, in the late 80s, early 90s, the leading edge, the most rapid graphical user interface development program around was called HyperCard, which was an Apple program that went with, the Apple Mac. And it was followed on by something written by a guy named Bill Appleton called SuperCard. And SuperCard was a phenomenal software development environment where, even frankly, even somebody with almost no software experience could take elements like a graphical user interface, a button, a field that you type into, a graphical element like a photograph or an image, a segment of video. You could actually, almost as a non-programmer, could learn very rapidly using SuperCard how to assemble a real live working program that would even talk to a relational database. And so SuperCard is what we chose for the software, the development environment. But it became so functional, it actually became the runtime environment. And so what we used was a standard Apple Mac off the shelf with SuperCard as the runtime development environment, an image of SuperCard. And we loaded the image onto the Mac, and it just ran flawlessly. It was a phenomenal, development program. Now, of course, later on, Microsoft caught up with Visual Basic, which was kind of like a similar development environment. And of course, now that's that kind of development environment is ubiquitous. It's the normal way to go.
Yeah, definitely. So you're creating the database using an off-the-shelf Mac, and I gotta ask. I mean, you may not remember the numbers, but what does one of these units cost you to manufacture?
Well, very expensive. We were spending in those days about $2,500 to build the whole system with the touch screen. And that was a fairly new technology as well at the time. All of this was kind of getting in the way, of making it work. So obviously it was never going to fly as a video game in a bar. It was only going to fly when people had it on their computer and then eventually on their phone or their tablets.
Gotcha.
So, but yes, those devices were costing at the time $2,500 each to build.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to put it all in my head now. You've got a device that's costing you $2,000. And you're obviously not selling it to the bar. You're just placing there like an operator, splitting the take. I'm guessing 50-50 is probably the take.
Exactly right, like any other video game.
Yeah. So there's got to be a lot of people logging on in order to just cover the costs of these devices. So since you said that you were working on the side, what was your day job during the whole Daterbase project?
Back in those days, my day job was working for Insignia Solutions, which is a British company that floated on the NASDAQ stock exchange. We developed soft Windows so that people with a Mac could run Windows inside a Mac. That was the very early days of operating system in emulation. So we had a license from Microsoft to emulate the Microsoft runtime environment. and deploy a Microsoft Windows inside a Macintosh environment. And then we extended that to Unix workstations. So Sun and Apollo workstations, they got, a version of soft Windows running inside their environment. So that meant that software developers and programmers and electronic developers, were able to pull up a Windows program at any time in the middle of their, Unix, usually a Unix environment when they're developing such things as software or, microchip designs, layouts, card layouts or chip layouts, whatever they're developing. So that was that was the software I was working on. Pretty popular company in its time. Everybody had soft Windows in those days if they had a Mac.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you needed access to software somehow. No.
Yeah. So, the company went public on the NASDAQ stock exchange. That was fun. I made some money. I wasn't a vice president, but I was a director working for a VP level guy. So I was earning some decent money, and it was, keeping the wolf from the door. But all the time I was trying to sell this database environment to venture capital companies. Sometimes just making a living gets in the way.
Definitely. I got to ask, since you started developing the project while you were still at Digital, was there any pushback from Digital about the rights to the project?
There might have been, but they never knew. Hey, man, it was my time at night.
Okay. So after you're done with soft Windows, do you stay on there after Database? Or let's wrap up Database. So at what point do you finally just call it a day on Database?
Pretty much when we failed to get venture capital funding and we were told that it was a sleazy project, which was about 4 years before Match.com went live with their multi-billion-dollar corporation using exactly the same stuff.
So you're in the early 2000s at this point, if I've got the timeline right. You've got another company that's gone public. I'm guessing that a couple of stock options shook out of that one. Nice.
Sure. Interior Solutions, we went public for sure. I made some money there, and then I got into an online event management systems company. To the point where we were able to connect to hotel and airline systems to book entire conferences for corporations, for their internal staff, and for their customers. So it's really serious kind of, enterprise level software. That company eventually went public. I got something out of that myself. But it was those days of the .com madness that went right the way through to 2010, 2011. I lost focus with trying to sell Database at that point.
I'll believe it. So I do have to, one quick thing about Database before I forget about it, because you did mention that you had some internal guidelines for how to deal with people's data, because obviously there was some very personal data that you guys were amassing. And with the advent of the internet, that whole conversation around data has become far more, far more direct. What were the guidelines that you guys were thinking about or implementing for yourselves?
To a large degree, the typical guidelines that you see today were not relevant because our system was a closed system. It wasn't out on the internet. We were not connecting with any third parties. We were not selling data to customers. And we actually explicitly said that we're not selling any of the client data or even aggregated data to any other customer. So it all became very easy. And so, the privacy policies that you see today are actually quite complicated. If you look at Facebook, you're not really sure what Facebook can sell of yours. With our system, we were able to simply say, your data is entirely confidential. We are not selling it to anybody, and we weren't. And we didn't even get the opportunity to anyway. So it was all very simple back in those days.
Gotcha. So you do the event planning projects. Again, like you said, corporate, very different level than something like Daterbase, where the average Joe Blow is literally going to be entering data and so forth. And where does your career go from there?
Well, come about 2010, and I'd gone through 2 or 3 startups that didn't go anywhere. And at that point, you know, in Silicon Valley at the age of nearly 60, it was very hard to get an interview with any company with people who are mostly 25, right? So at that point, I decided to retire. And now I'm running a non-profit organization running supplies into Haiti and to, you know, to humanitarian aid areas like Haiti. So right now I'm sitting aboard a boat and we're about to receive, it's actually in storage near here right now, we're about to receive 55 bicycles, 40 recycled sails. We already have a cargo of medical supplies to fill up the dispensary of a hospital in Haiti that right now is utterly empty. The government has failed. The president was assassinated 2 years ago. And frankly, for the last nearly a decade, I've been doing that, basically running supplies to disaster relief and humanitarian aid areas.
I gotta ask, I mean, where's the impetus for this? Where did this come from? How does the idea gestate and come to fruition?
Funny thing, when I left digital, I was about 4 years without work, and I developed a business plan to develop a non-profit, you know, an NGO, a non-government organization, to do disaster relief work. And that kind of went by the wayside when Silicon Valley went nuts and I got good employment again. But when I was then unemployed and looking for work, I just dusted off the old business plan and created a humanitarian aid organization. And part of it was to do with doing it by boat. So our mission is to provide humanitarian aid to disaster ridden areas that are island or coastal communities. And so that can only be done by boat. And I like to go sailing. So I just put the fact that I like to go sailing together with developing a lifestyle of doing disaster relief and humanitarian aid. And now I can go sailing for free.
Oh, that's awesome. And what's the name of the organization?
We're International Rescue Group. In fact, it's on my T-shirt right here. IRG.
There you go. Yeah.
And it's internationalrescuegroup.org.
Excellent. We'll put the link.
And we have a fundraiser right now, and it's $10,000 to get us to Haiti with all these supplies. And so far, we only have just under $4,000. So if anybody would like to send money to internationalrescuegroup.org, we'd be most grateful. Thank you.
I will definitely post all the links in the show notes and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
So, I mean, this is an amazing career. Let's be honest. I mean, it's not the high flyer thing, but what you've been through, you know, the transition from build your own tech, build your own hardware, to mainframes and mini computers, to basically a transition to software. Right. A project like Daterbase, where you're using off-the-shelf components and so forth. And that evolution, like you said, with the different ways of developing a product where you're trying to do it all in unison with the hardware and the software, to back to an almost software, a world where the software is its own thing. And in fact, doing emulations of operating systems. So you really are completely agnostic from the hardware at that point.
Yeah.
It is a fascinating, not snapshot, but it's a fascinating insight into the evolution of the tech industry from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I felt it happening at the time. I mean, one of the big transitions was software as a service,
Yeah.
where, at one time we developed entire systems, and we deployed it on whatever it may be, PC or Macintosh or workstations or servers. We deployed an entire solution on mini computers, and now, you can build a business in corporations, enterprise software as a service, and it's become completely normal now to deliver software that way. And I'll never forget people like Larry Ellison, of course, of Oracle Computer, who thought that the cloud was a stupid idea. Do you remember those days when Larry Ellison hated the cloud? And now everything Larry Ellison is doing is in the cloud. So it's been interesting to go through that.
Oh, definitely. I mean, just the world where everything was a closed off system, and now everything, you can just access anything. I mean, hell, we're talking to each other on the opposite sides of the planet practically. And yeah, it's everything.
It's been a roller coaster ride, hasn't it?
I got my first machine in '85 when I was 8 years old.
Right.
And my career hasn't been in technology, but every aspect of my life has been in technology. And yeah, just the idea, I do consulting work sometimes. So you're getting, a contract from the other side of the world. You're talking to 3 different people at the same time, trying to work out how you're going to fix it. And during the pandemic, I teach at a university, teaching all my classes online, uploading the virtual blackboards and the notes and corrections over email. It's insane.
And what, having seen, obviously for me from the early days, I'm now nearly 70, right? And I've seen it from the early 60s, and having watched it grow and actually been a part of the corporations, that develop those systems and software. And it's been really exciting. It's been a good run, I have to say. I would not turn the clock back and do it a different way.
No, come on. I mean, I can only imagine what the excitement of being at a startup, with, if this works, we got this payday coming. And will it work? Who knows if it will work? That must have been a tingle, just,
Yeah. Oh, it was a roller coaster ride. I mean, when people talk about the .com industry in Silicon Valley, it was, it truly was absolute madness and a land grab that nobody has ever seen in the world before, anything like it. And global giants like, Google, Facebook, companies like that.
Yeah. And so many that never amounted to anything, that just sort of disappeared into the ether. Fascinating. So there's one question that I end all my interviews with. It's really a 2-parter. So I ask my interview subjects, looking back at your career, what is one thing, one development in the industry that you did not see coming, that took you completely by surprise? And what was one development that you thought was going to be huge that ended up petering out and going nowhere?
Oh, wow. That's a really tough question. Okay, so let's take the first one. What is it that I didn't, what was it that I didn't think was going to happen that went
didn't
crazy?
See coming that became huge?
I got to tell you that everything we're seeing now, I pretty much was on top of from the very early days, and I saw it all coming. I'm sorry if that sounds awfully arrogant, but no, I can't think of anything that really caught me by surprise. What caught me by surprise sometimes was that I couldn't take advantage of it quickly enough. I didn't become one of those rich guys, right? That's where I failed. But as for something I thought was going to be really big that didn't happen, no, I think there's probably a few of those. What would it be? that is such a tough question to ask.
Trust me, you're not the first person to be stumped by it. It's okay.
Well, there are a few. I mean, one of them is, for an example, is self-driving cars. I thought that was going to happen a lot earlier, and now we're probably still 5 years away from a truly recognized self-driving car that the market might be comfortable with. Maybe it's 10 years away. I mean, Elon Musk and Tesla think it's going to be a lot earlier, and they think it's around the corner. But I think in reality, it's probably 5 years away now.
At least.
I must admit, I thought that was going to be a lot earlier than this.
The lawyer in me says you got 20 years because the lawsuits against the corporations for every death that thing causes, that you'd have to have a complete shift in the way that liability applies legally for that to work. But yeah. Well,
you use the keyword liability, and I've really put a lot of thought into this, and I actually wanted to get into that sector for a while. Did not end up doing that but I think the key is that when insurance companies start to sell policies that are cheaper for a full self-driving car, then they've gone through the actuarial tables, and they've determined that the technology has finally made it, and it is actually safer to be in a full self-driving car than a human being driving the car, and it would be manifested by the premium policy cost, and an insurance company is not going to mess that up. They will get it pretty much right. And it's interesting to note that Tesla and Musk have got into the insurance business, and to me that's critical, because they think that they're going to win not only in the motor car and the charging industry, and they are doing in both already, but they're going to win in auto insurance as well. And that's just it's just a ridiculous way of making money out of a car. The car company making a killing in the insurance business. And I think what will happen is that once they own the insurance company, and the company says that full self-driving cars are actually now less liable to cause an accident, and the actuarial tables start to stand up to that, then they're going to have a whole other business, multi-trillion-dollar business on their hands, and it will also legitimize the full self-driving program.
That is an extremely insightful view, and you know what? I agree with you. The only problem I see with it is that in order to create those actuarial tables, you need
people are going to die.
Yeah, you're going to have the actual accidents.
Yes.
You're going to have the actual accidents.
Yeah.
And I think that the path to getting that statistical data is going to be so expensive that you may never get that statistical data, or at least not for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, so here it is. That is exactly why I say, and I believe, and I'm probably too optimistic, because I always thought the full self-driving cars would have happened long ago, and I was wrong. But I still think that it's about 5 years away. But I imagine you probably think more like 10 to 20.
I'm thinking 10 to 20.
Probably, based on track record, you're probably more right than I.
But I definitely like where you're going with it, just because it's one of the banes of my existence is having to actually drive a car. If I could just sit back and not worry about it, it would be so nice.
Yeah. So I hope that's an answer to your question.
It definitely is.
It's not an area that I was personally involved in. Although I have to drive past Tesla at Fremont on Route 880 twice a day for about bloody 10 years or whatever it was.
Oof.
And that was a killer of a route to drive in rush hour. So I put a bit of time thinking about it, right?
Awesome. Well, Ray, do you have any final thoughts?
Final thought. I suppose the only one I can think of right now is that if younger people are listening and if they think they've got a great idea, like, I proved to have but failed to implement to my own advantage, I can only say, if you've got the ability to stay loose and flexible and keep plugging at it, even if you're 5 or 10 years ahead, even if you have to sort of, sacrifice a lot of things, including beer and cigarettes and posh cars and beautiful women or good-looking guys, whatever it may be, if you've got to sacrifice, and if you really believe in the idea, then I wish some people could do a better job than me and make it happen. Because I had a great idea that was obviously a multi-billion-dollar idea, and I just couldn't get it to the market, and that was a big loss. And I think about it, frequently, and I kind of was amazed when you heard about it, because Daterbase was nearly 30 years ago for me, and it's long ago in the past, but it brought it all back in a rush.
Well, I'm glad I was able to do that because, like I said, when we first talked about it, the idea of the device, the way that it was described in the trade publications, it just sparked my imagination for everything that system could have been. And knowing the timeline, which obviously no one could have known at the time, that the internet was about to be opened up, that, suddenly, almost overnight, everybody was going to have an internet connection at home. Then, it's just one of those situations where you were off by 2 years, 3 years at most.
Well, maybe 5.
Well, yeah.
But fundamentally, our timing was out. Yep, you're right.
Your timing was off, but there's no way to know that, and your implementation of it with the technology available to you is still an admirable achievement, in my opinion, and is the kind of innovation that you never know what it sparks, and you probably should have tried to patent at least some of the tech in there.
Yeah, we should have, but we decided to just try and stay ahead of the competition, and we were. But that doesn't count if you don't have the funding to make it happen.
Oh, of course, and the whims of venture capital are fickle at best.
Well, Carl, right now I've got a US Air Force jet over my head, and I can't hear for about the next minute. Can you hear it?
No, I can't hear it at all. That's
Skype like my phone is cutting out the sound. Believe me, it's loud.
I'll believe it. I will believe it. Let me know when it's passed.
Okay, the plane's gone by now.
Okay. Like I was saying, the whims of venture capital are fickle at best. Right. So, Ray, thank you very, very much for sharing your stories, for sharing your career, and yes, in a worst case scenario, it will definitely be inspirational to at least one or two people out there.
Well, to me, that's the best case scenario. So I'm happy with that. And thank you for the opportunity to bring some of these memories back to the fore. Because some of this is long gone for me and long past. And I had to dig deep for some of these years.
Well, that's what I like to do, There's no reason why it should go unrecorded.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.